January 22, 1943, 9:17 a.m. The jungle heat of Guadalcanal felt absolute, suffocating the air around Second Lieutenant John George as he pressed low into the dilapidated frame of a Japanese bunker. Through the magnified lens of his scope, he fixed his gaze on a sprawling banyan tree positioned 240 yards distant. For 6 agonizing weeks, his peers had subjected him to relentless ridicule over the specialized rifle now cradled in his hands. He was 27 years old, a former Illinois state champion marksman, yet he carried the humiliating burden of 0 confirmed kills. In the last 72 hours, the Japanese operating in the Point Cruz groves had executed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment, utilizing the devastating accuracy of 11 skilled snipers. George's commanding officer had dismissed the rifle as a mere toy, while the other platoon leaders, with biting sarcasm, dubbed it his mail-order sweetheart. The weapon in question was a Winchester Model 70, equipped with a Lyman Alaskan scope and secured by a griffin and Howe mount. When George had first unpacked the sophisticated gear back at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer had innocently inquired whether the setup was intended for hunting deer or for engaging Germans. George had clarified that his target was the Japanese forces. Ironically, the unit had shipped out before the custom-ordered rifle ever arrived, leaving his personal weapon languishing in a warehouse back in Illinois. He had embarked on the arduous voyage to Guadalcanal, forced to observe other men diligently clean their standard-issue Garands, knowing his own superior firearm remained thousands of miles away. Determined, he had utilized the military mail system to request its immediate forwarding. 6 weeks later, in the closing days of December 1942, a supply sergeant finally delivered the object of his long wait, a wooden crate conspicuously marked "Fragile," holding the rifle he had secured only after saving 2 years of his National Guard earnings. The rifle itself possessed a manageable 9-pound mass, with the scope and its mounting adding 12 ounces. The standard issue M1 Garand, carried by every other man in his battalion, weighed 9.5 pounds, yet offered no optical magnification whatsoever. George's rifle was a classic bolt-action design capable of holding 5 rounds. In contrast, the standard-issue Garand was a semi-automatic weapon, carrying 8 rounds. Captain Morris, his immediate commander, had explicitly ordered him to leave the sporting rifle secured in his tent and to carry a real weapon. George, keenly aware of the sniper threat now facing the regiment, chose to carry the Winchester, regardless of the order. The 132nd Infantry had recently relieved the weary Marines on the island in late December 1942. The Marines had endured combat since the preceding August, successfully seizing and holding Henderson Field. Yet they had failed to capture the strategic Mount Austin or effectively clear the Japanese forces from the coastal groves situated west of the Meticulously River. Mount Austin dominated the landscape, rising 1,514 feet, and was heavily defended by the Japanese, who referred to it simply as the GEU, fortified by 47 bunkers and defended by 500 men. George's battalion had launched its assault on December 17th. For 16 grueling days they fought, suffering 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally managed to seize the western slope of the mountain on January 2nd. During that bloody siege, George had never once fired his Winchester in combat. His kill count remained exactly 0. The dense terrain surrounding Point Cruz presented a wholly different challenge. Here there were no fixed positions or bunkers. The Japanese soldiers, who had strategically retreated westward from the Henderson Field area, had dug in among the massive trees. A significant number of these soldiers were designated snipers, utilizing scoped Arisaka Type 98s. They possessed an intimate, almost seamless knowledge of the jungle environment and understood the tactical advantage of patience, knowing how to conceal themselves and wait. The deadly efficiency of these sharpshooters was undeniable. On January 19th, a sniper had killed Corporal Davis while he was simply refilling canteens at a nearby creek. The following day, 2 men from L Company were killed during a routine patrol. On January 21st, 3 more soldiers died, one tragically shot through the neck by a hidden marksman nestled within a tree that the patrol had walked past not once, but twice. That night, the battalion commander, worn thin by fear, frustration, and mounting losses, summoned George into his tent. His earlier mockery of the mail-order rifle was gone. He spoke now like a man cornered by death itself. Japanese snipers were killing his soldiers faster than malaria, and his unit was unraveling under the invisible pressure of an unseen enemy. What he needed wasn't just another rifleman. He needed someone who could outshoot the ghosts in the trees. He fixed his gaze on George and demanded to know if that rifle of his could truly hit anything or if it was just another soldier's fantasy. George responded with the quiet authority of a man who knew his craft. He didn't boast. He listed facts. He was the Illinois state champion of 1939 at 1,000 yards, the youngest ever to win the title. He had made 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights alone, and with the Lyman Alaskan scope on his Winchester, he could consistently place 5 shots inside 4 inches at 300 yards. Reluctantly, but with no other option, the commander granted him until dawn to prove the rifle's worth. George spent the night with ritualistic precision, reviewing every inch of his weapon. Even though the Winchester had already survived the long journey preserved in Cosmoline, he cleaned it again, brushing, oiling, checking the mounts, and loading it with the .30-06 hunting rounds he had brought from Tennessee. By dawn on January 22nd, he slipped into the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker overlooking the vast coconut groves near Point Cruz. Intelligence claimed the snipers favored the monstrous banyan trees, 90-foot giants with trunks wider than a doorway. A man could climb up before dawn and stay hidden all day, completely invisible from the ground. George went alone, carrying only his rifle, 60 rounds, and a canteen. In the bunker's shadowed shelter, he began scanning the treetops with the low but reliable 2.5 times magnification of the Alaskan scope, moving the lens with agonizing slowness as he filtered out the jungle's endless noise and focused solely on movement. At 9:17 a.m., he saw it, a branch shifting in still air. 87 feet up, 240 yards out, a Japanese sniper was perched in a natural fork of 3 thick branches, watching the supply trail. George adjusted 2 clicks for wind, steadied the Winchester, and exhaled. The trigger broke cleanly. The distant figure jolted and fell, crashing through layers of vines and branches before slamming into the earth. George reloaded instantly, searching for the inevitable second man. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, the shooter and the spotter. At 9:43, he found the partner descending a nearby tree, trying to escape after hearing the shot. George led the moving target, fired, and the second man dropped. 2 shots, 2 kills. He remained motionless, scanning again. At 11:21 a.m., a round struck the sandbag wall inches from his head. He rolled aside instinctively and pressed into the bunker. The shot came from the southwest. For minutes, he didn't move. At 11:38, he found a third sniper 73 feet up. The enemy had shifted positions within the same tree instead of relocating entirely, which was a fatal mistake on their part. George fired again, dropping him instantly. By noon, he had 5 kills confirmed. Word spread. The men who had laughed at his rifle now wanted to watch him work, but George refused. Extra bodies meant noise, silhouettes, attention, and attention meant death. The remaining snipers adapted immediately, staying frozen all day. At 1600 hours, he returned to headquarters where Captain Morris, now fully respectful, ordered him back at dawn. January 23rd began with violence from the sky. A tropical downpour drowned the jungle in sheets of water, smearing everything into mud and erasing visibility. George waited in silence until the rain eased. At 9:12, he spotted a sniper nearly 300 yards away, one who had climbed into his tree under the cover of the storm. They were learning his range. He compensated, fired, and brought the sixth sniper down. But this shot triggered a dramatic escalation. At 9:57 a.m., Japanese mortars began raining down around his bunker. The first barrage fell short, the second fell closer, the third would be a direct hit. George sprinted from the bunker just as it exploded apart behind him. Relocating to a fallen tree 120 yards north, he resumed the hunt, killing a seventh sniper at 14:23 and an eighth at 15:41. By 1700 hours, he returned to camp with 8 confirmed kills from 12 shots, an almost unnatural level of accuracy. That night, as he cleaned his Winchester again, he replayed the day's engagements. 11 snipers had been reported in the groves. 8 were now dead. The last 3 would be the most experienced, men who had survived because they made no mistakes. Men who now knew what George looked like, how he operated, and the distinct signature of the Winchester's bark. At 3 a.m., sleepless, he sat with the rifle across his knees as rain hammered the tent. The heavy rain at dawn on January 24th gave him cover to change positions entirely. He chose an old Marine machine gun nest built among massive rocks, offering superior concealment and angles. When the rain lightened, he began scanning again. At 8:17, he found a sniper hidden low in a palm, too low, too obvious. It felt wrong, a trap. He scanned again, refusing to take the bait. 11 minutes later, he found the real threat, well hidden 91 feet up a banyan tree with a perfect line of sight to George's previous position. The solution came quickly. George shot the decoy first, knowing the true sniper would react to the rifle's sound. As the man shifted, turning toward the noise, George fired again and dropped him. Then he grabbed his rifle and ran as machine gun fire shredded the rocks he had occupied seconds earlier. After relocating twice, once into a drainage ditch and then into a cold, water-filled shell crater, George continued scanning. 10 kills confirmed. 1 sniper left. This last man, George realized, would be the most dangerous of all. At 9:47, he understood what he had overlooked for days. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, moving. George spotted him crawling through the undergrowth, using vegetation for cover as he approached George's presumed route of escape. But when the sniper reached the old rocks and took a firing position, George hesitated. It was too obvious. Another decoy. Expanding his view, he found the true threat. Another sniper behind a fallen tree, rifle aimed exactly where George should have been. 2 men working together. He submerged until only his eyes remained above water, holding the rifle upright to keep the barrel dry. When the decoy rose and signaled, both men began sweeping eastward. As they passed George's hidden crater, he rose from the water like a phantom, aimed at the nearer soldier, now 42 yards away, and fired. The man fell instantly. George worked the bolt, swung the rifle toward the final sniper. George had only 5 rounds left in his Winchester, and at least 6 Japanese soldiers were closing in. It was a hopeless situation for anyone armed with a bolt-action rifle. He considered the few choices he had: stay hidden in the water and pray they walked past him, or fight until the rifle went dry. The voices kept getting closer. 30 yards, 25, 20. At 10:31 a.m., one Japanese soldier reached the edge of the crater and looked straight down. For a split second, their eyes locked. George fired from beneath the surface. The man fell backward. Without lifting the rifle from the water, George racked the bolt and forced another round into the chamber. He rose just high enough to see 2 more soldiers at the rim. He shot, worked the bolt again, and shot a second time. Both men dropped. Now he had only 3 rounds left. More shouting followed. The remaining soldiers were spreading out, approaching from two different directions to trap him. George knew staying put meant death. A bolt-action rifle could not go head-to-head with multiple enemies armed with faster-firing weapons. He had to move before they closed the circle around him. Gripping his Winchester, George sprinted north through the tangle of vines and branches. Bullets cracked through the undergrowth behind him, chopping into trees as he ran. After 90 seconds of pure instinct and adrenaline, he dove into another crater, this one dry. He lay still and listened. The voices faded. The Japanese had stopped the chase, choosing instead to regroup around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud coated the stock, and water still dripped from the barrel. He was down to 2 rounds. The rest of his ammunition was gone, lost in the water-filled crater where the fight had begun. By 10:47 a.m., he began moving again, this time slowly, using every dip and shadow of the jungle for cover. The forest was silent except for his own breathing and the rumble of distant artillery. At 11:13 a.m., he reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him, and George identified himself at once. The sentry guided him through the lines, and George headed straight to battalion headquarters. There he reported to Captain Morris, who asked him for a full account. George laid out the numbers. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days, using 12 rounds, 11 hits. In the final skirmish, 3 more infantrymen were killed with 5 rounds. Morris then asked how much ammunition he had left. George answered plainly, 2 rounds. The rifle still worked, he added, but it needed urgent cleaning. Morris dismissed him for the day. No missions tomorrow. Their battalion was shifting east, and the area around Point Cruz no longer mattered. Intelligence said the Japanese were preparing to abandon Guadalcanal entirely within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent and immediately stripped the Winchester down to its smallest parts. For 2 hours, he cleaned away every trace of mud and moisture, running oil-soaked patches through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope, tightened the mounts, and loaded 5 fresh cartridges. At 1400 hours, he received an unexpected order from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see him. George prepared himself for criticism, perhaps for engaging too aggressively or for moving alone. Instead, he found Captain Morris and 2 senior officers waiting, including Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry asked a single question. Could George train other soldiers to shoot as he did? George said yes, but only if he had time, proper equipment, and men already skilled with rifles. Ferry explained that the departing Marines had left behind 14 Springfield rifles fitted with untold scopes. Additionally, 40 men in the regiment had qualified as expert marksmen. George's new assignment was clear: create a professional sniper section, train the men, and eliminate any remaining Japanese snipers still threatening the American lines. George agreed on one condition: he would keep his Winchester. Colonel Ferry approved immediately. Training began on January 27th, 2 miles east of Henderson Field. George started with 40 men. They were accurate shooters on paper, but none had hunted another human being from concealment, and none truly understood the patience and discipline sniping required. The Springfield rifles with their long, unearthed scopes weighed 11 pounds, heavier than a Garand and heavier than George's modified Winchester, but their heft made them steady firing platforms. George hammered the basics over and over: breathing control, trigger squeeze, and reading the wind. He taught them to use logs, rocks, roots, and anything the jungle offered to stabilize their rifles, because perfect firing positions rarely existed in real combat. Training was relentless. For 3 days, the men shot at stationary targets at distances up to 400 yards, then at moving targets, then at targets partially hidden by leaves and branches. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 could reliably hit a man-sized silhouette at 300 yards under real jungle conditions. George then formed 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, guarding the shooter and helping locate targets. They regularly switched roles after kills to maintain sharpness and prevent over-reliance on any single marksman. On February 1st, George led 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese stragglers west of the Meticulously River. Before sunrise, they had positioned themselves along a supply trail. At 7:20 a.m., a Japanese soldier appeared. George fired once and dropped him. Over the next 6 hours, he engaged 7 more soldiers, killing 6 and missing an 8th by a hair because of shifting wind. The other teams performed just as effectively. By evening, 23 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Not a single American was wounded. Throughout early February, the sniper section operated with efficiency and precision, accumulating 74 confirmed kills by February 9th. These were conservative counts. Only bodies physically confirmed were recorded. Meanwhile, the Japanese evacuation intensified and destroyers arrived nightly to retrieve their troops. Rearguard units fought delays stubbornly while George's teams hunted them. On February 7th, near the Tanamboa River, George was shot. The bullet tore through his left shoulder and spun him to the ground. His spotter, Hayes, dragged him into cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious but survivable. No bones were shattered and no major vessels were hit. George was taken to a field hospital and remained there for 2 weeks. By the time he recovered enough to stand, the battle for Guadalcanal was over. The Japanese had fully evacuated. George's sniper section, active for only 12 days, had posted 74 confirmed kills without losing a single man in sniper operations. The division recognized their impact, and Colonel Ferry recommended George for the Bronze Star. But the war had other plans for him. While he healed, classified orders arrived. The Army needed experienced officers for a special mission, operations deep in the jungles of Burma. George volunteered immediately. By March, he was on a transport ship headed west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70, cleaned and protected, was stored in a waterproof case. The Lyman Alaskan scope lay wrapped in oilcloth. George knew nothing specific about the mission, except that it demanded men who could survive the jungle and strike with precision. It sounded like exactly the kind of work he was built for. When the ship reached India on April 3rd, George received his final briefing. He and 200 other officers were joining a secret new unit. It had 3,000 men and no official designation yet. But the soldiers already had a name for themselves. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. George's reassignment to the 2nd Battalion placed him in a curious position. Officially, a rifle platoon leader, but unofficially the man everyone quietly relied on when a shot absolutely had to count. The Army technically had no designated sniper slots in its organizational structure, but Colonel Ferry's emphatic endorsement, written after witnessing George's performance on Guadalcanal, had crossed the ocean and resurfaced in India. The battalion command understood that although his paperwork didn't label him a sniper, his skill with a rifle placed him in a category all his own. Training in central India introduced the first stage of their preparation for the Burma campaign. Though the land was different from Guadalcanal, the fundamentals remained the same: choking humidity, sweltering heat, and vegetation so dense that visibility often shrank to a few feet. Burma, however, would dwarf anything they had seen before. Its mountains were steeper, its rains more punishing, and its Japanese defenders far more familiar with the terrain. The Marauders were heading into a place where even the jungle itself seemed engineered to break an army. Understanding this, George began altering his equipment with an almost scientific precision. His Winchester Model 70 had served him faithfully on Guadalcanal, but he knew Burma demanded something lighter for patrols that could last weeks. He removed the Lyman Alaskan scope, rugged but relatively heavy, and swapped it for the leaner Weaver 330. The magnification remained the same at 2.5 power, but the weight savings mattered. He replaced the wooden stock with a synthetic version, trimming precious ounces from the rifle until it weighed just under 9 pounds. It was still a precision instrument, but now it was a precision instrument built for endurance. Over long marches carrying 60 pounds of gear, this mattered more than anyone not walking the trails could appreciate. When the marauders moved into Burma in February 1944, their objective was clear: seize the Myitkyina airfield, a site vital for maintaining Allied supply routes into China. What was unclear, at least on paper, was how a force with no vehicles, no artillery, and only pack mules for supplies could cross hundreds of miles of jungle that the Japanese considered effectively impassable. The terrain was a relentless chain of mountains, rivers, and forests, dense enough to obscure the sun. Every ounce of equipment, every ration, and every bullet had to be carried by hand or on the back of a mule. George's battalion set out on February 24th, and in the first week alone covered 83 brutal miles. Men collapsed mid-march. Malaria cases mounted. Animals stumbled on the steep descents and had to be put down. Yet the marauders pressed deeper, driven by a mission that demanded constant motion rather than territory held. By March, they had trudged 217 miles and fought a dozen engagements, quick bursts of violence followed by immediate withdrawal. The marauders were never meant to win set-piece battles. Their purpose was to disrupt, disorient, and keep the Japanese guessing. During this period, George fired his Winchester only 3 times. The first was at a Japanese officer directing troops across a river more than 400 yards away. The second was at a machine gun nest that threatened to pin down a patrol. The final shot killed a sniper who had already wounded 2 marauders. 3 shots, 3 kills. George fired once per engagement because he had no choice. The distinctive crack of a bolt-action rifle could betray his location instantly. Fire, relocate, disappear. That was the rhythm of survival. The long march to Myitkyina lasted 3 agonizing months. By late May, the men had trudged more than 700 miles. Disease ravaged them with more brutality than bullets. Dysentery, typhus, and malaria hollowed out the unit until fewer than 3,000 effectives remained from the original 5,300. But they reached their target. On May 17th, they seized the Myitkyina airfield. It was a strategic triumph and a human catastrophe. The marauders were so depleted that the unit was declared combat ineffective. Exhaustion, malnutrition, infection, and relentless combat had pushed them beyond human limits. George survived Burma, but he carried with him a hard-earned realization. In this kind of jungle warfare, a precision rifle like the Winchester Model 70 was rarely needed. Most combat took place at distances so close a man could smell the sweat of the enemy. Visibility shrank to the reach of an arm. Ambushes erupted from 10 yards away, sometimes less. The very terrain erased the long-range advantage that had defined his marksmanship in Illinois and Guadalcanal. The bolt-action rifle, magnificent though it was, belonged to a rapidly fading era. The battlefield was shifting toward semi-automatic weapons like the Garand, standardized, durable, and fast. When the marauders were finally evacuated and the unit disbanded in June 1944, George returned to the United States. He was promoted to captain and assigned to Fort Benning, where he trained new infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. His Winchester remained with him, stored quietly in a footlocker. Across the world, armies were moving toward uniformity, identical rifles, identical training, identical expectations. George understood the need for standardization, but he also knew something intangible was being lost. The idea that an individual soldier's exceptional skill could alter the course of a battle. After his honorable discharge in 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, George pursued academic life with the same determination he had shown in the jungle. The GI Bill carried him to Princeton, where he graduated with top honors in politics. He studied further at Oxford, then spent years in British East Africa examining political structures. Eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C., where he became a respected voice on African affairs. Through all of this, he rarely spoke of Guadalcanal or Burma. His colleagues knew he had served, but not how he had lived or survived. That same year, in private, he began writing. He wanted to preserve the technical truths of jungle warfare before memory softened their edges. 6 months later, he had a manuscript exceeding 400 pages. A friend connected to the National Rifle Association urged him to publish it. George hesitated. It was a book of observations, ballistics, rifle mechanics, and battlefield realities, not heroics. But the NRA pressed, and in 1947, Shots Fired in Anger was released. It became a classic, valued by historians and firearms experts for its clarity and honesty. His descriptions of Japanese small arms remain unmatched. John George lived long enough to see the evolution of military rifles and the rise of sniping as a formal military discipline. He watched new wars unfold and new rifles replace old legends. He died in 2009 at the age of 90. His Winchester Model 70 now rests in the National Firearms Museum, often overlooked by visitors who mistake it for an ordinary hunting rifle. But in truth, it is an artifact of remarkable significance. This weapon proved how a single, exceptionally trained marksman equipped with a civilian rifle could change the course of battle, even in a war dominated by industrial firepower. It is the embodiment of the idea that individual skill, in the right moment, can still shape history. George's success, achieved with a bespoke weapon against a professional threat, suggests that true effectiveness in warfare is not solely determined by mass production, but by the cultivation of singular, almost artisanal skill. His legacy asks whether we can afford to sacrifice the power of the expert craftsman, the man who knows his personal tool so intimately that he can perform the impossible in the relentless pursuit of unified, impersonal efficiency. Does true heroism lie in carrying the standard issue, or in mastering the weapon that is right for the fight, regardless of what the regulations prescribe?